Hello and welcome to Stations, Squares and Statues, a podcast that wants to get people out into their local communities to reassess the places that they take for granted. Today we are discussing a recent publication from Huddersfield Local History Society titled Meet Me at Harold Wilson, Stories from St George's Square. My name is Georgie. I have a Master's in Public History from the University of York and I work for Kirklees Museums and Galleries. And joining me today is Christine Ferguson. Christine holds a PhD from Huddersfield University in journalism and is one of the co-compilers and writers of the book.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
No problem. So I've given the title of the book there, but would you like to explain a little of what the book is about?
Yeah, it's not quite the title because we actually in the end called it Meet Me at Harold Wilson. And the subtitle is Stories from St George's Square.
Yeah.
And as you said, it's surprising how public spaces are taken for granted. And this is not something that Huddersfield Local History Society decided to do off their own bat. You know, we hadn't got a burning desire to write about St George's Square. But along came Historic England with their, this is such a mouthful, their Historic Street Heritage Action Zones initiative, funded by HM Government and managed by two fantastic officers from Kirklees Council. And they asked for ideas. They were, Historic England, their main, I suppose, in their main part was to actually renovate the George Hotel, which had been closed in 2013, and estate buildings, which they owned. But they wanted a cultural programme to go along with that, and they invited cultural organisations and community groups to submit ideas. And as a society, which always responded to civic challenges and heritage challenges, we felt we had to do something. And one of those ideas was to do a book on St George's Square, but the society has a very good publishing record. So this was something we had expertise in. So that seemed a good idea. There were a few other ideas which were not so favourably received. But we didn't want it to be a straightforward narrative. I don't want to be, it sounds a bit patronising. In a way, it's a history from below, but that's not quite right about this book.
Yes.
But certainly, and again, it sounds a bit like an overstatement. We wanted to produce a people's history of St George's Square through the eyes of people who've used it and the buildings in it. And it seemed to us there were two ways to go about finding that one of which was to collect people's memories, and this way we could involve as many people as possible, in the community, and also through the normal sorts of, I suppose you would say academic research, looking for, in the archives, looking at the original sources, and it would have been really difficult to do without the British Newspaper Archive, which meant that we could get the eyewitnesses of the time, not just the journalists who were reporting on the events, but quotes from the people who were there. And at the same time, to an extent, we wanted to include what happened during the 3 years of this. We called it HOUSE for short, the HOUSE project, and that included a fantastic event. Was it last year? I think it was, with sheep.
Herds,
yes, the herd. And that was just amazing. I mean, the talent, the colour, the community spirits, the involvement of people in that just showed what a public space could be used like. I mean, we haven't got the peace hall here in Huddersfield. It could have been the peace hall disappeared under different management years ago. So but we have got other public spaces, and what we found too was that so many things had happened here. I think I've said in the book, and it's pretty obvious, that we could have done a whole book on politics alone, because it's the place, to an extent in the past, people also, and still now, people demonstrated or protested in the Market Square, but that's small. St George's Square is the biggest public space in Huddersfield. So and so you've got everything from you've got very dodgy electioneering tactics in the middle of the 19th century when there was no secret ballot. You've got people later than that wanting the extension of the franchise, wanting to vote. You've got suffragettes. Mrs. Pankhurst came to St. George's Square. You've got anti-war demonstrations throughout the First World War. And it goes on to recent events.
Yeah.
The very big event was a couple of 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. People gathering there when it looked as though possibly Huddersfield Royal Infirmary would close, or at least its A&E. So it was that history continued all the way through. So
I think what I like about it is it very much, there's often the misconception that history happened in the past and it's gone and we just think about it retrospectively. But I do like that it comes all the way up until 2023 and the stories in the book from a whole host of things. And I think the variety in what has happened in the square is reflected in sort of the chapter titles as well. And if you just read the chapter titles, there's things, well, I've got a story later about animals and, like you say, politics and protests and a whole host of things that have happened in that square. And like you say, it was very much a community project. And one of my favourite parts of the book is the community contribution. So the memories, like you say, they're in sort of blue speech bubbles throughout the book. And I sort of wondered, did you find that people were very willing to give those when you asked for them? Or did you find there was some sort of hesitation? Or did you feel that people were bursting at the seams to sort of give their memories?
So it was a bit between all of that, really. I mean, this wasn't an oral history project because we didn't have the resources to do an oral history project. And if we had, we would then have had a selection process, which we didn't want to do anyway. You know, we'd have to see what groups we might focus on, that sort of thing. But we just didn't have the people power to do that. So what we did was we set up a website, which is now more or less stopped now the book's being published, which was one way of, at the beginning of the project, advertising that we were here, and it was a place that people could get in touch with us, send things in, and we would include them, and we did as we went on. We asked people for images, not just for words. We did press releases and to people to get in touch with us, which was enthusiastically taken up by KLTV here and by Huddersfield Hub. I want to say anything about the local paper that's been with us for years. And the Yorkshire Post took a step as well. And then we put ourselves in history type public events. The West Yorkshire Archives moved out of what was the Central Library building to a temporary premises on the piazza for the first year of the project. And not only did I make use of their resources there, but they had a couple of big events there where people, some were over a few days. I think one of these events coincided with Heritage Open Days a couple of years ago, for the first year of the project, and we sat there and we talked to people, and we put a little exhibition on, and I wasn't averse to nipping up to someone and saying, "Oh, I see you looking at that picture," and explaining what we were doing. We also went to the family history fair and that sort of thing, and we had articles in things like the Huddersfield District Family History Society and the British Association for Local History. So that reached people who didn't live in Yorkshire or Huddersfield. But we could have done with more things. There are two things which actually there are two ways of collecting which never would have occurred to me beforehand. But in connection with this, I found there was an old book that had pictures of Huddersfield railway station inside the trains over the years. Unfortunately, fortunately, it's obviously out of print, that sort of thing. But there was a gentleman, I think in Paddock actually, who has a shop which opens so many hours a week, which sells lots of old books about trains, and he had a copy of this, so I arranged to go and see him. It turned out, and I bought the copy of the book. Couldn't use the photographs of the end, couldn't trace the copyright, but I discovered, he'd been an engine driver working out of Huddersfield Station.
Wow.
Yeah. So I nipped out, got out my phone, and we had a chat, and I recorded him with his permission.
Oh, great.
And a similar thing happened with my hairdresser, because she was asking what I was doing, said what I was doing. Oh, yes, I used to work just the area. And so forth. And we arranged that next time I had my haircut, I would bring my phone in.
Oh, great.
And both those people do appear in the book.
Yeah.
In fact, there's very few things that we haven't used, really.
I think that's the thing I'm finding, having just moved here to Huddersfield, is people are really willing to talk about their experiences, but it's finding the right way to get those things from them and to reach them in those right ways is the most important thing. I think, so obviously we've talked about memories, but that does lead quite nicely onto sort of why you think the book is important and what you think it brings, really, because I think we both agree that it is important, but I think I'd like to hear why you think it is important.
Important's a funny word, really.
Yeah, it is.
Because in a way, it's not important. but I know, I think it's really good to know why that square is there and why it's of use, and that Huddersfield is not a depressing place, but there's lots going for it. And there's one thing to convey, of course, it's important to convey that things change. Yet some things stay the same, as we've talked about, but also things change a lot over the years. So, so I think it was what I think I said before, the idea of doing a people's history. I didn't realise it would take up 3 years of my life.
I know, yeah. Well, I think it's been worth it, and I think, like you say, the sharing of these stories and having the people's history is so important for keeping heritage alive. And I like that, like we say, history will continue to happen, and I think it happens every day. And so this collection of stories is evidence of that. Yeah.
Yes, that sounds interesting. I read that a lecturer I knew at Huddersfield University had told History Today. This was some years ago. I think quite a lot of years ago. They drug him up on and they said, "When do you think history finishes?" And he said 1968. When I saw him next, I said, "Do you really think it finished in 1968?" He said, "No, of course not." So
yeah, that's what I think. I think that this book encapsulates that, like we say, you've got stories in there all the way up until 2023, and it will continue to happen. And it'd be nice if there was a part 2, in however many years. I find it sort of quite life affirming in a way that each of these individual stories and memories on their own might not seem to that person important, but put together create something really powerful, I think. So yeah, like we said, I really like the contributions, but we can talk sort of what the book's about. But I think the best way to give people an idea of what things are in there is to give some examples. So do you have a favourite story from inside the book?
Well, I think I mentioned the hairdresser, and I think in some ways it was the circumstances in which the memory was collected, but in other ways it wasn't. She started, it was by St George's Square, so it means this High Street Heritage Action Sales, although there have been shops around it, it's not a high street, and it's a very strangely shaped square in effect. So Railway Street and Station Street, which come into that, those areas, they're sort of part of the square as well, and so we covered those. And she got a job as a Saturday girl doing hairdressing at first. And I was very sorry I couldn't put everything in because it wasn't relevant, because she'd been a skinhead back in the day.
Right.
And she talked about, walking around the shops dressed as she was, with hair as she had in those days, and things like that. But and the guy who owned the first of all, it was, when she first took over, I think it was Miss Nancy. Sorry, if I just let me find this.
No, that's okay. We both have got copies for anyone listening of the book in front of us. So, and Christine's got some bookmarked pages.
Yes. Yes, it was called Miss Alder's Coiffure, if I pronounced that right. And every time the phone rang, I didn't like saying Miss Alder's Coiffure. When I first there, we had a cellar which was absolutely full of the old hairdressing remedies like bay rum and things like that. And then she talks about the mayor arriving, and she was a shampooist, and she got her hands, it really affected her hands. One day, she came in the mayoral car, and she used to park outside the door. When she was going, she went to Ralph Cuthbert's, the local chemist, at the entrance of the Byram Arcade, and she bought me some cream. She was so concerned about my hands, bless her. But then Miss Alder, and I found her in the old street directory, is this Miss Alder, she retired, and then another chap came. And he was a bit of a joker, the hairdresser Jeanette says. And he took me on as apprentice, and he used to do some tricks on me. He used to send me across to a state building to the caretaker there. And he used to say, could I fetch him a long stand? So I'd find myself stood outside the caretaker's having asked for a long stand. So it's and it goes on. There was a glass hammer and that sort of thing. And as I said, he used to make her take his little dog for a walk as well, dressed in her skinhead finery.
That's brilliant.
But she had life as a skinhead at that time. That came out too, and it wasn't relevant to the book, but it was a fascinating story.
Yeah, I really like that. I think those sort of nuances, that everyday today things that potentially could have been lost are now preserved in there, which is really lovely.
Well, perhaps I should say, not favourite stories, but there was tragedy as well. There's a lot of accidents, not now, but in the past, because often when the forms of transport came, they were new as well. So in the early years, you get someone being the paving wasn't level. As a cart, something like that, ran into and knocked over a chap, and he died. There were lots of instances of that sort of thing. In fact, I actually wrote an article about just accidents in the square for the Huddersfield Local History Society Journal. I thought it was a story worth telling. But the most tragic of those was a tram, I think it was in 1883, from Lindley. And trams had been introduced in January of that year, I think it was July, and it came around the corner too quickly. Only to come out of control. There's pages and pages in the local newspapers on it, and I didn't attempt to actually analyse, what happened. I just relied on the eyewitnesses' accounts to say what happened, rather than saying it myself. But 7 people died, and years later, the same route, the Lindley tram, the same thing. And no one was injured that time.
Right.
But a lady who'd been on the tram when people died as a result, it was on the tram that day as well, and she collapsed, but
wow,
she was all right by the end of the day. Also, they said in the paper.
Yeah, I remember. I've looked at that chapter, and I remember a bit about that. But that's amazing. Yeah, that's coincidences is astonishing. I've picked out a slightly sillier one as my favourite, but I'm calling it the donkey chase.
Oh yes.
And it stood out to me when I was reading through. It's in the chapter titled "Animals in the Square." And yeah, briefly, the story goes that in 1853 there was a wedding procession walking through the square, and they were harassed by 12 donkeys with riders decorated in rags and straw with broomsticks over their shoulders, sort of like a farcical sort of brigade. And so it was thought at first that they were part of the wedding, but then it soon came to light that they weren't part of the wedding party. And then as time went on, a huge crowd gathered. And the wedding party then tried to escape sort of out the back door of the church, but then the donkeys were informed, and then they chased after, and you can imagine a sort of just a big to-do in the square. And what I sort of liked about it was there isn't actually really a conclusion to the story, and that eventually, they were driven away by police, but we still don't know why they were there. And I just like the silliness of it, the idea, the mystery, and there must have been sort of some pre-planning going on because they all turned up at the same time. So it was obviously pre-planned, but I just have so many questions that we'll never know the answer to. But I think the absurdity of it is what I really liked about that story.
It's funny you should say that, because that's the very first story I put on the website.
Oh, really?
In the, from the archive section of the website.
Yeah.
You might notice it's quite early on, and I started my search I went back and did a bit of the earlier stuff later, but I started my search in about 1850, and so that was one of the first ones that came up that seemed worthy of note, or easy to deal with, as opposed to things about the political stories we've just mentioned, which need more explanation.
Yeah, no, I liked it. It stuck in my mind. Well, Christine, thank you very much for joining me today. My aim was to sort of capture the essence of the book, and I feel like we've done that quite well. Thank you all for listening, and I hope our discussion has inspired you to go out into your local area and maybe take another look at what you think and consider the stories that have gone before, but also how your own stories fit into our space, because I think that's really important, because everyone's story is important, as we've discussed, and this is what the book showcases so well. So Meet Me at Harold Wilson is available in multiple locations in Huddersfield as well as online. It is only £5, which I think, for the amount of care and consideration and the quality of the stories and the images in there, I think that is very affordable. So I really encourage you to go out and get your own copy. So thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.